Ooh. Hello, YouTubers! My name's Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have for you reaction request 122. Geneseed. Turning a boy into a super soldier. This is part of Arch Warhammer's video sets, and has been requested for me to react to by CJ Falcon and Brutality 616. So let's check it out. Play. Dun, dun. Dun, dun.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Today we are going to talk about Geneseed. Because I've been wondering how to do this Space Marines lore video, because just doing a video on the Space
45 minutes.
Kind of boring, I find, because the Space Marines are so much more than just being the super soldiers of 40k. It's one of those things that makes 40k so special. In many other sci-fis, you have super soldiers, and they're just that. Super soldiers. They're a dime a dozen these days. But the Space Marines and their chapters is something very, very different from just the classical super soldier. Because whilst on the outside they might seem like the quintessential super soldier with his armor and his weapons, deep down they are so much more. The individual chapters and the legions from which they hail all have so much backstory. They have their own traditions, they have their own doctrines, their own methods for waging war, their own victory celebrations, their own initiation rites, their own command structure, their own heritage and pride, which raises them so far below the dime a dozen super soldiers of most fantasy universes and makes them into a living, breathing part of 40k. Instead, I am going to tell you about the various chapters, but before we get to that, I need to give you a basic understanding of what a Space Marine is. What is it that turns a boy into an Adeptus Astartes, into one of the Emperor's avenging angels? And that is, of course, the question we will be answering in today's lore video on Geneseed. And later on, I will be talking about the legions, their primarchs, their heritage, their history, and of course, the individual chapters, and how they have deviated from their parent legions, or perhaps, in a few examples, how they have not deviated at all. In other words, I don't think I will ever just make a Space Marine lore video, because, as I mentioned, I think it would be a disservice. Instead, I will simply give every little piece its individual lore videos and treatments, because, frankly, they deserve it. So, enough with the preamble, let's actually get into it. First and foremost, what precisely is Geneseed? Because this is a term that some of you might not know. Essentially, Geneseed refers to a collection of biological and mechanical components that make a Space Marine what he is. Namely, humanity's finest warrior and one of the Emperor's biological masterpieces. But let's get a little bit more specific, shall we? Because Geneseed is really also a catch-all term for all 19 of the various organs implemented into a Space Marine to make him into, well, a Space Marine. And I could now go into detail about how the various germ cells within the Geneseed goes through a process that is quite similar to cellular mitoses, and go through the rest of the actual complicated medical nonsense, but let's be honest here. 1, I am no biologist, and I'll probably get most of it wrong, and 2, it is of course fantasy pseudoscience, and probably has absolutely nothing to do with reality. So instead, let's skip over that phase, and rather go into what the various organs are, why they are there, and how they are created. And we'll start with the how. So, a single gene seed will create the biological basis and also the mechanical basis, since the gene seed is made up not only of biological components, but also microscopic machines that reform the human body.
Nice.
These two biological and mechanical components store all of the information necessary to create the various organs based upon the DNA pattern within. This DNA pattern is then used to grow the new organs that will be implanted within the brand new Space Marine. Additionally, by the way, this is a particularly nasty little problem here, but most of these organs can only be implanted into people that are very, very young. The maximum age of a recruit that is going to be undergoing these surgeries is 12 years old. Preferably, he should be no older than 10. And considering the fact that most Astartes will be serving in the Scout Corps before they are elevated to the full status of Battle Brother and receive all of their various implants, the Adeptus Astartes, in the most literal sense of the word, makes extensive use of child soldiers. And just to make you a little bit more uncomfortable, these children are recruited at that kind of age where you think you know everything, where you are invincible, you are the king of the world, and everything is exactly as you have been told. Additionally, all of these children are indoctrinated in an extremely fanatical religious creed, that of course being the worship of the Emperor. Now, many chapters view the Emperor in different ways. Some view him as an outright god, others view him as the finest man to have ever lived, etc. But regardless, the initiates are undoubtedly going to be receiving their fair share of indoctrination, both into the various ideals and values of the chapter, and most likely also into the Imperial Creed. To put it rather bluntly, children are taken, brainwashed, indoctrinated, turned into murderous, rampaging zealot killing machines, and then thrown at the Emperor's enemies in the name of defending his domain.
Yep. Sounds
what can
about
I
right.
say? Welcome to 40 fucking K. Welcome to Grimdark. Ye all and sundry. In some other sci-fi universes, we have edgy scenes where our hero kills supposedly children off-screen. In this universe, we take those children and turn them into batshit insane religious mass murderers. Fucking lovely, ain't it? But enough about that, let's get back to that whole DNA pattern, shall we? This is the DNA pattern of the chapter, or indeed the original Legion's, Primarch. This means that when a Space Marine gives on his gene seed to a next neophyte, he is not passing on his own DNA. He is in fact passing on the DNA of his Primarch.
Nice.
This is why Primarchs and their soldiers often have several traits in common, including both purely physical traits and also personality traits. For example, Horus Lupercal was famed for being an incredibly direct and aggressive general. As such, his original legion, the Lunar Wolves, gained a reputation as decisive shock troops. In the same manner, Rogal Dawn's Imperial Fists have sticks so far up their asses that even the Imperium's finest surgeons could not possibly remove them. And this stick is indeed a gift from their Primarch, who possesses the largest and most deeply rooted stick of them all. In other cases, the similarities might be more different, for example in the case of the Word-Bearers and their Primarch Lorgar. Lorgar was a strange Primarch. I'm very much so looking forward to doing the lore video on him sometime before 2020. Because he was weak, mentally speaking, he, despite being a superhuman with incredible mental capacities, was entirely reliant upon some outside force to grant him guidance. This also imprinted itself upon his legion, making them fanatically loyal to whatever higher cause Logar deemed worthy of their praise. Which is why the Word-Bearers, even though they understood the nature of chaos and how it was not a good thing, still chose to follow it, and indeed devote themselves wholeheartedly to it, purely because Logar said so. And of course, we also have cases of far more obvious physical similarities, like for example in the case of the Space Wolves, who grow long, sharp canines, and develop an abnormally powerful sense of smell, even for an Astartes.
Wow.
And all these similarities hail from the same source, namely the Geneseed. And as such, when the Space Marine is receiving his various implants, these implants are of course already filled with that very Geneseed. The very first implant that an Astartes will receive is his secondary heart, along with his osmodula and biscopia implants,
Wow.
known as phase 1, 2, and 3. And these 3 implants are usually all introduced at the same time in a single surgery, although there are chapters that practice different rituals for turning their initiates into Space Marines. For example, they might insist on that all of the implants will be carried out one by one, so that the secondary heart would be implemented, then they would wait a bit, then the osmodula, and then the biscopia. And this might in fact be downright detrimental to the chances of creating a fully functional Space Marine.
Yeah.
However, they might still do it for reasons of traditions. In some cases, they might even entirely skip certain implants, or the Geneseed may have deteriorated to such a degree that that particular implant is no longer functional, in which case it is usually dropped. Some chapters even add in new elements to the transformation process, as is the case with the Space Marines and their Canis Helix, which gives them their fangs, their heightened senses, and also has just a teensy-wincy, itsy-bitsy chance of turning them into bloodthirsty, monstrous werewolves.
Nice.
Probably worth it. Alternatively, a chapter might have traditions surrounding the surgeries themselves. For example, an initiate will be required to fast between the first 3 phases and the next 2 phases. Alternatively, it could be the exact opposite, where a recruit is expected to feast, drink, whore, and whatever else, to remind himself that he was once a man, but that he was now becoming so much more than a man, and as such he should take pleasure in these simple activities whilst he can. Regardless of the traditions surrounding it, the effect is much the same. Once this first round of implants has been granted, the initiate's body will start reshaping itself to closer resemble that of his Primarch.
Nice.
This ensures that the various organs will not be rejected by the body. Essentially, it is turning his body into a simulacrum of the Primarch. Thusly, these organs are not foreign, they are indeed the very organs that are supposed to be there to begin with. And so, when they take root, they will begin taking nourishment from the body and providing their various benefits to the body as if it had always been there. This is also the primary reason why there are no female Space Marines. All of the DNA is male DNA, as all of the Primarchs were males. And the difference between a male human and a female human as far as DNA is concerned is on average 15 times greater than between a male or a female and a female. Now, of course, you could make the argument that this is science fiction, therefore they could simply invent a reason for there to be female Space Marines, but, well, it would require us to find a female Primarch, otherwise it simply wouldn't work. The Geneseed implementation process is specifically designed for male DNA. The difference between the two is simply too large. So unless Games Workshop comes out and says that one of the missing Primarchs was a woman, I'm afraid that female Space Marines just isn't going to be a thing. Ever. Unless GW just goes, fuck our old law, we're just gonna invent some new bullshit, which is, to be fair, not entirely impossible. But what is the benefits of these new implants? Let's dive into that and look at each implant in turn while I walk you through the process of turning a boy into a Space Marine. As mentioned, the first and easiest of the implementation processes is that of the secondary heart. This organ is also often referred to as a maintainer and is hooked up to the initiate's normal circulatory and pulmonary systems. The primary benefit of the secondary heart, obviously enough, is to pump more blood and therefore more oxygen throughout the initiate's body, allowing him to perform at a far higher level than even the most physically fit human. It also serves the purpose of an emergency life-sustaining system. If, for example, the Astartes' primary heart is turned into pulp by, for example, the introduction of a high-velocity lead projectile, then the secondary heart is expected to keep the blood pumping throughout the Astartes' body at a high enough rate to keep the poor bastard alive for long enough for an apothecary, essentially a field medic, to reach him and stabilize him. An additional benefit of the increased circulation is that it means that there are more Laraman cells in the bloodstream. The Laraman cells are essentially an extremely effective coagulation serum that activates once exposed to the outside world. This means that when an Astartes takes a wound, the blood will gush out as usual and almost immediately coagulate, creating a cork sealing the wound and preventing the Space Marine from bleeding to death.
Nice.
The next implant is the os modula, and this is considerably more difficult. It is an implant that is placed near the initiate's pituitary gland at the base of his brain. Literal brain surgery. Although for this one, they'll probably go through the neck instead of, through the top. This placement allows the organ to connect itself to the initiate's endocrine system, where it almost immediately begins flooding the initiate's body with growth hormones. These specially engineered bad boys grant the initiate with a massive increase in his muscular and skeletal structure. Over the course of the next 2 years, these growth hormones are combined with a rather unique diet, consisting of an extremely high in sugar and energy diet, combined with microscopic amounts of good old-fashioned metals. In other words, for the first 2 years of his existence, the initiate is expected to live off a diet consisting almost entirely of sugar, proteins, and iron. Whilst the various other minerals and resources the body requires not only to keep itself alive, but to sustain this ridiculously rapid rate of growth, is usually provided via injections rather than the diet. Over the course of the next 2 years, the initiate will grow in size and weight rather considerably. At the end of the 2-year period, he is expected to stand around 2 to 2.5 meters tall, almost twice as broad as he was once the process was initiated, and weighing around 300 to 500 kilos. And practically all of that is pure muscle and bone. And Astartes' bones are rather different from normal humans. First and foremost, they are much, much, much thicker and tougher. They also regrow at an incredible pace compared to normal human bones. Additionally, the entirety of the rib cage has fused into one large piece of bone, providing the Astartes with what is essentially a subdermal piece of armored plating. It does make conducting surgery on Astartes a little bit more complicated, however, which is why the apothecary carries around the narcoticum, which is essentially a giant fuck-off drill. And of course, the end result of this transformation process is a grotesquely over-muscled beast of a man, which results in increased toughness and a huge increase in overall muscle mass throughout the Astartes' body, making him much, much stronger and much, much faster than anything that should be humanly possible. And the final implant to be placed within the initiate's body during this first round of surgery is the biscopia. The biscopia could be considered to be a companion organ, perhaps, to the os modula. While the os modula is pumping the human body full of growth hormones, the biscopia is essentially a tiny little computer that directs and controls the flow of hormones created by the os modula, making sure that, for example, the initiate's bone structure does not increase exponentially before his muscular structure is capable of actually supporting the extra weight. It would, after all, be somewhat counterproductive if the bones inside of his legs grew so quickly and solidified to the point where he would no longer be able to operate them effectively with his current muscle mass. Yeah. But that's not the end of this little mini-computer's work day. The biscopia will continue to regulate many, many other implants that will be placed throughout the initiate's body over the course of turning him from a boy into a space marine. And even when its duty as a professional manscaper is completed, the Biscopia will continue to regulate the fully grown Space Marine's body, helping it deal with poisons, diseases, and various other afflictions that would affect normal humans. The Biscopia is also the organ responsible for making the Astartes essentially immortal, as long as they don't get blown into tiny little pieces on a battlefield, as it will continuously be able to allow the body to reform its cellular structure. Basically, while normal humans eventually lose the ability to replenish their cells at a rapid enough rate to make up for the degradation, the Biscopia constantly keeps the Astartes body in peak fighting condition, completely and utterly untroubled by the usual degradations that so blight humankind. Oh, and by the way, there is one final little note. This is the first in a set of surgeries. There will be several more. And there was a mention that these surgeries are supposed to be carried out without anesthesia of any kind. Now, I'm probably gonna have to call bullshit on that, unless they've got some really, really special technology that is specifically designed around this. Which they might. I mean, it's not physically impossible, but it's pretty goddamn close, and it would be really ridiculously dangerous. The mortality rate on this would be sky-fucking-high. And here's the reason. The first one needs to implement the secondary heart. This is described as one of the easiest ones. And the secondary heart is, of course, connected directly to the patient's circulatory system. But here's the thing. When you are slicing someone open like that, and you need to implement an organ a little bit smaller than the old heart, to do that, you're gonna have to probably do a lot of cutting. And in all due likelihood, you might even have to break a rib or two to give you enough space to really get in there and place the organ. And here's the kicker. Beneath every single rib is a nerve, which means breaking that would hurt a lot. Additionally, the ribs do help with the respiratory system, so yeah, it would lead to a whole bucket load of complications. Now, they might have special tools that would perhaps inflate the secondary heart once it has been passed down between the ribs, but even then, we are talking a lot of pain. In all due likelihood, the guy's heart would already be beating ridiculously quickly because he would probably be just a teensy-weensy bit frightened and in an absolute metric arse ton of pain. Now, what do you think happens when you cut into a guy's circulatory system while his heart is beating full fucking overdrive? Yeah. It would go very, very badly. It would go remarkably badly. Now, granted, if this is done with robotic precision and speed, it is possible, but even then, I mean, your odds of survival are not fantastic, so
not fantastic at all.
I might call partial bullshit on that part. At the very least, it would increase the mortality rate by an absolute ludicrous percentage, and the Imperium, while not being particularly fond of innovation, would probably be able to notice, every time I cut into this guy's circulatory system, blood goes fucking out in a stream, and this often causes the patient to die. If I were to somehow reduce the speed at which his heart is pumping blood throughout his body, by, for example, giving him anesthesia and making him not be completely and utterly freaking crazy on the operating table, it might increase the chances of a successful operation. I think they would be able to conduct that particular leap of logic without too much difficulties. And after this bout of surgery, the initiate is allowed to rest up and heal for a little bit, making sure that he doesn't die, if he hasn't died already from the original surgery, which, as I mentioned, probably has got a little bit of a risk factor to it. But once he's healed up enough for the second round of surgeries, 2 more organs are going to be implemented, the hymastamen and the Laramens organ. The first one, the hymastamen, I don't fucking know, is relatively easy to implement. You simply just pop it in some place where there's lots and lots of blood. For example, a main artery. And what it does is, it takes all of the blood that passes through it, and it, over the course of the next 2 years, subtly changes the composition of the blood, increasing its ability to carry oxygen. This is also the reason why Astartes have a lighter shade of red for their blood than normal humans, because it has a far greater oxygen capacity. And then, of course, we have the Laraman's organ. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier. This is a tiny, tiny organ about the size of a baseball that is implanted within the initiate's chest cavity. Once properly installed, it also starts changing the blood, just like the whatever the fuck. Except instead of increasing the oxygen level of the blood, this one messes around with the platelets inside the blood. This serves to increase the clotting potential of the blood. This, as I mentioned earlier, is going to mean two things. One, the Astartes is not going to be bleeding to death, and two, since the wound will almost instantaneously be sealed, it is literally a matter of a couple of seconds, any potential infection will also almost certainly be halted right in its track.
Yeah.
This obviously makes Astartes very, very, very difficult to kill. It is a well-known scientific fact that most soldiers are indeed more effective if they have their blood on the inside of their body rather than the outside. All in all, this round of surgery is a hell of a lot gentler than the last one. Considering the size of the Laraman's organ, it can probably be placed within the chest cavity without having to open up any more ribs. But this is, of course, just the quiet before the storm. The next organ up is the catalepsian node. This organ is implanted, again, in the brain. More brain surgery. Lovely, because that's usually a nice and risk-free operation, isn't it? And this one is particularly unrisky, since it's implanted directly onto the cerebrium itself, at the very top of the brainstem. After all, nothing bad could possibly come from poking sharp objects into that part of a human, now could it? However, the organ is very, very useful. It monitors the higher brain activities of the Adeptus Astartes, and specifically, it is looking for high levels of stress and fatigue, usually caused by a lack of sleep. Once this occurs, the node starts cutting into the brain, not physically, but cutting off access to certain portions of the brain. It starts deactivating less important sections, making sure that the brain will be able to stay awake and alert for longer. This allows the Space Marine to remain fully active for way, way longer than any human could even dream of. However, it does also start having some rather unfortunate little side effects. For example, extremely vivid hallucinations, or an intense sense of paranoia. As you can probably imagine, these two psychic effects do not mix particularly well with a half-a-ton armed and armored super soldier. Assuming the recruit survives this second foray into his brain pan, he has lots and lots of more lovely surgery yet to go. The next set includes the implementation of 3 more organs: the preomenor, the omeophagia, and the multilung. The first of these 3 is the preomenor. This is a second stomach, or to be more entirely precise, it's a pre-stomach. It is spliced in above the Astartes' normal stomach, and it is used to catch up anything the Astartes might eat and analyze it, checking for toxins. If it finds toxins, it is usually good enough to neutralize most of that shit on its own. If, however, it is a particularly virulent toxin, then this organ can be completely isolated from the rest of the Astartes' digestive system. The toxin can then simply just be vomited back up again or rerouted to somewhere safer inside of the body. For example, the Bletcher's gland, which is where the Astartes store their poisonous, and often corrosive, spittle. Yes, the Space Marines can spit poison.
Nice.
They don't use it particularly often, but they can do it. The next one on the list is the omeophagia. This organ is operated directly into the recruit's spinal cord. And this is, well, it's one of the bullshit organs. Let me be entirely honest, this one probably just would not function. Essentially, what it does is that when an Astartes eats something, he is capable of analyzing what he eats and somehow extracting information directly from its DNA. To put it in another way, let's say that an Astartes eats an animal that is a native to a certain planet. He can then experience some of that animal's lived experiences and draw upon that information as if it was its own. For example, let's say that this was a herbivore, and it's figured out that certain plants are poisonous. Now, the Astartes would now be armed with that very same knowledge, that the red bush is poisonous, but the green one is edible, etc. How the fuck this is supposed to work, I have absolutely goddamn no idea. I'm not even going to try and explain it. It's one of those relatively few things in 40k that I kind of just have to look at and go like, well, it's sci-fi, isn't it? The next one is the multi-lung. This one should be rather obvious. It, just like the secondary heart, is a third lung, implanted into an Astartes pulmonary and circulatory system. This, of course, allows the body to absorb more oxygen, which can then be sent into the bloodstream to provide for the heightened blood-carrying capacity of both the blood and the second heart. Without this organ, then the increased oxygen-carrying capacity of the blood and the increased pumping capacity of the second heart would be kinda pointless.
Yeah.
It, of course, also acts as a temporary emergency replacement. If one of the Astartes' lungs is punctured, he can still operate relatively well for an extended period of time on two. And even if both lungs are punctured, he can still live for long enough to receive aid. And of course, if all three are compromised, well, in that case his chest cavity has probably been blown open by some high explosives. And at that point, whether or not the Astartes can breathe is really not the biggest issue. And thusly, with the successful, assumedly, conclusion of this series of operations, our young initiate is halfway to becoming a proper space marine.
Only halfway.
Next up is a series of single operations, starting with the implementation of the oculobe. This is a modification done to the initiate's eyes. It is also done directly to his optical nerves, which means that in all due likelihood, they've got to pop his eyes out of his skull and then work directly on the nerves themselves. This is the first stage in a rather lengthy process, but luckily the rest is not surgical. After this part is done, the initiate will be having regular sessions at the chapter's apothecarium, where his eyes will be adjusted and subtly altered to the point where they will be able to pick up light much, much better than normal, which allows the Space Marines to operate even in extremely low light conditions.
Nice.
Next up on the chopping block is the poor recruit's ears, which will be surgically removed and replaced with so-called lineman's ears. These things, although externally virtually identical to human ears, have a far more complex internal structure. It increases the Space Marine's balance by an absolute arse ton, and makes him virtually immune to being dizzy or motion sick. It also increases his ability to hear things by quite the degree, and more importantly, it increases his ability to filter out sound, allowing him to, for example, hear a conversation that is taking place on the other side of a crowded restaurant, while completely blocking out the rest of the noise. Next up is yet more brain surgery. Considering how much they're messing around in this poor bastard's head, you'd think they could just shove all of this in there at once. Well, you know, it might mess with each other, but hey, details. It's pretty much just an open package at this point anyways. Yeah. I'm pretty sure they've actually implemented a fucking backdoor into his cranium at this point. Anyways,
if he survived everything else, he should be able to survive that.
This one is implemented directly onto the recipient's cerebrum. Once properly installed, the membrane then begins to grow until it covers the entire brain and becomes an integral part of the brain structure. This is pretty much useless on its own. However, after a series of chemical therapy sessions and training by the chapter's apothecarians, this organ allows the Astartes to enter into a state of suspended animation, either voluntarily or as an emergency response to absolutely devastating trauma.
Okay.
This state can continue for, well, pretty much as long as you want, really. But the only way to bring an Astartes out of it is through extended hypnotherapy by the chapter's apothecarians. Now, as I mentioned, it can go on for pretty much as long as you want, as long as he's getting basic medical treatment and his body is being given the various resources he needs to survive, because, of course, even though the body is in suspended animation, it still burns a certain amount of energy just, you know, keeping blood pumping, etc. The longest recorded case of one of these suspended animations was undertaken by battle brother Silas Eyre of the Dark Angels chapter, who was revived after a mere 567 years.
Wow.
That is one hell of a power nap, no doubt about it. Next on the list, we have the Melanochrome. This one is also referred to as the Skin Shield, and is attached directly to the recruit's lymphatic system, thereby controlling the amount of melanin in a Space Marine's skin. It also subtly changes the biological makeup of said melanin. This allows the Space Marine to tan ridiculously quickly, thereby protecting himself from the ultraviolet rays of the sun. It also provides considerable protection against other types of radiation, which means that the Space Marine can survive even in a nuclear environment without his armor for quite some time without taking any permanent damage. Then we have another surgery set, where both the olytic kidney and the neuroglotis will be implemented. We'll start with the olytic kidney, or what I like to call the oh shit organ. This is installed directly inside of the Astartes' abdominal cavity, and it essentially acts like an oh shit button, just like the name will suggest. Basically, if the Astartes is ever inflicted with some kind of poison so virulent and toxic that his normal system simply cannot deal with it, his body can shut down entirely, sending all of its remaining energy to the olytic kidney, which will then begin drawing all of the bad shit out of the Astartes' body and into itself, after which it will violently eject the awfulness directly from the Astartes' bumhole. Yes, what I just said means that the Astartes will fall unconscious, straight on his face, ass up, and then moments later, a steady stream of disgustingness will fire from his ass. I don't know if Space Marine Power Armor is designed specifically with a oh shit hatch as well, to allow for a freer flow of the awful. Otherwise, I'm assuming that said Astartes will be deeply, deeply uncomfortable for the rest of the campaign. You know, this really is one of the less glorious parts of being a Space Marine. We never see this in the novels, do we? Imagine the scene. Brother Rogal fell flat on his face after having been hit by a Dark Elf poison dart. Moments later, a stream of the most vile excrement fired in bursts from his anus, covering his battle brothers in a kind of greenish-yellow poop. It's the kind of thing that just doesn't get written down that often. Odd, isn't it? Next up on the surgery list, we have a nose job in the form of the neuroglotis. This organ is implanted inside of the Astartes' nasal cavity and allows him to detect very, very, very subtle odors. In fact, it increases the sense of smell of the Astartes round about to the level of your average canine. Not quite as good as the Space Wolves, but a hell of a lot better than any human. This allows the Astartes both to track his quarry through smell alone and to determine whether food or water is poisonous. Quite useful if you're stuck on an alien planet and you don't know what's edible, and you don't have access to any of the local wildlife so that you can eat their soul and gain their lived experiences. Next up, we have the mucranoid. This is a rather fanciful one. Essentially, it is an organ that allows the Space Marine to create a thick, vicious mucus that pours through his skin to seal him inside of a cocoon of sorts. This is activated by external chemical stimuli, usually self-administrated, or administrated by the Astartes' armor if it notices that something has gone very, 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 very wrong indeed. The idea is that this protective layer will form around the Astartes and protect him against the environment. This would, for example, allow an Astartes to survive in the icy cold vacuum of space for an extended period of time, assuming that the membrane has been deployed early enough. It might also protect him if he ever gets submerged in water, for example. Generally speaking, it's not much of a defensive action, since of course the membrane itself will provide absolutely no protection towards, for example, an orc with an axe. However, if an Astartes was shot down during a space engagement, for example, or vented into the void, or otherwise lost in a non-hostile environment, non-hostile as in not filled with orcs, then he will be able to survive for an extended period of time, hopefully, and then get picked up by a search and rescue ship. And then, of course, there is the ever-famous Becher's gland, or to be more precise, Becher's glands, since there are two of them located inside of the Astartes' mouth. These, if consciously triggered, will allow the Astartes to spit out a disgusting wad of corrosive goopy goop. The substance is rather nasty, more than enough to blind anyone it hits in the face, and could quite potentially kill your average human. But it is relatively rarely used as a weapon. In fact, it is more commonly used to digest particularly nasty substances. Say you're stuck on a planet and you have nothing to eat except rocks, well, then the Astartes can technically eat the rocks. Granted, he isn't going to be gaining much nourishment from it, but he can potentially eat the rocks if he so chooses.
Nourishment to live, then
and
that's
now
good.
We are almost done. Only 2 implants left. The second to last one is perhaps the most important, the progenoid glands. These are the actual Geneseed glands. An Astartes is implanted with 2 of these, one in the neck and another in the chest. These 2 organs are there purely to gather the Geneseed that now courses through the Space Marine's veins. His DNA has been rewritten in such a way that he is now a proper Space Marine, and as such he is constantly producing Geneseed. These germ cells are then gathered up inside of the progenoid glands and harvested either upon the death of the Astartes or in a ceremonial action. Some chapters don't harvest them in ceremonial ways at all, but most do because better safe than sorry. The one in the neck is ready for harvesting after 5 years, and the one in the chest after 10 years. And after they have been harvested, they can be used to create new Space Marines. Each of the glands is enough to create 1 full set of organs, which means that each Space Marine can create 2 further Space Marines. And all of the implanted organs are created from this genetic material.
Nice.
Which is why it is the chapter's most vital treasure. Every single progenoid gland harvested, either on the field of battle or in the safety of the chapter's apothecarium, is another guaranteed Astartes warrior. It is quite literally the future. And it is highly valued by other, less glistening Space Marines. The Chaos Space Marines place an incredibly high value on progenoid glands. They themselves have almost entirely lost the abilities to reproduce Geneseed on their own. Additionally, their Geneseed has become heavily polluted by the warp, which means they are in effect sterile at this point in time. As such, to create new Space Marines, they have to steal the Geneseed of other legions and corrupt it to their own uses. Now, the Imperium still stores considerable quantities of traitor Geneseed, but mind you, it is not traitor Geneseed as in the Chaos Legions. It is simply Geneseed from the traitorous Legion, so this Geneseed is pure and unaffected by the actions conducted during the Horus Heresy. In other words, the Imperium could recreate the Lunar Wolves, or the Word Bearers, the World Eaters, or the Death Guard. Although, of course, doing so might have some risks. Certain legions would almost certainly be relatively safe. For example, the Lunar Wolves would in all due likelihood be fairly safe. The Death Guard would also be pretty damn safe as long as they are recruited from Terran stock. But stuff like the Word Bearers, I wouldn't try that. And the World Eaters, well, they do have some anger management issues. They would probably still be relatively useful as long as you didn't hammer those spikes into their necks. But I think I probably wouldn't try that just yet. And the final implant, before our brave and miraculously still alive recruit can be called a true Space Marine, is the Black Carapace.
What is
this? Is a neuroactive web of organic fibrous material which is implanted directly beneath the recruit's skin. The way they do this is that they quite literally skin the poor motherfucker alive, implement the Black Carapace across his entire body, and then drape the skin back over him again. Ouchies. Good God. You know, there's a meme going, if you're a fan of Star Trek, you want to go to the Star Trek universe. Of course you want to do. If you're a fan of Star Wars, you want to go to the Star Wars universe, because awesome. If you're a fan of 40K, you don't want to go to fucking 40K. Even like becoming a space marine. Do you want to become a space marine? Oh, does that mean that I have to undergo 19 excruciatingly painful surgeries, or well, slightly less, and then finally get flayed alive while some crazy motherfucker plants an organic fibrous material all over my body? Fuck that shit. I'm staying right the fuck here. But hey, assuming that our young recruit is still alive, this is a relatively safe procedure, just excruciatingly painful, and still sane, less likely than being alive, but hey, you're a superhuman killing machine now. You don't necessarily need your humanity.
Humanity's overrated.
But with the Black Carapace fully implemented, the Astartes can now directly interface with his power armor. That is the point of the Black Carapace. It melds itself to the recruit's neural network, his very nerve endings, and allows him to plug in directly into a suit of power armor. Now, this surgery is not necessary to operate power armor. You can still move it without this, but it makes it considerably more responsive, since now your suit of power armor is quite literally a second skin rather than simply a suit of armor. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you make a space marine. Or at the very least, the biological and medical process involved in creating a space marine. There's also a few decades of hard training as a neophyte and as a scout before any of this happens, but this is the final stages of uplifting a young boy into a big, brutish, and angry monster. Don't try this at home, kids. Not only because you don't have the requisite technology, but also because I'm working on some space marines of my very own, and I didn't want any competition. Oh, and please don't mind the screams coming from the basement. As you have undoubtedly realized after listening to this procedure, screaming is perfectly natural.
Most likely.
Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon.
You too, Arch.
Have a good day.
Okay, well... So that was Arch Warhammer's Geneseed, turning a boy into a super soldier. If you want to go check out Arch's stuff, there's a link in the description to help you get there. So go check it out. Recommend it. You know, yeah. And this has also been requested by CJ Falcon and Brutality 616. So, thank you for recommending it. Quite entertaining stuff. My thoughts on it. Well, they definitely go through a lot, don't they? And it really does help explain the preparation they go through to fight. Because they've got to be this way. They're super soldiers. They're moving tanks. Barely human anymore, but it's pretty cool stuff. That's really all I got to say about it. Yeah, nice to know how to make a super soldier. I am currently on. This was 122 of the reaction request list that I uploaded. So go check out that video to see what's next. Yeah. And y'all have fun. Willie out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.